The next speaker will be Jose Daniel Lara, who is currently a PhD student in the Energy and Resources group at the University of California, Berkeley. His research interests include the analysis and simulation of power systems, microgrid design, and mathematical programming under uncertainty, especially in the area of energy policy and electric systems. And I'll also note that he is a registered professional engineer in Costa Rica and a member of the IEEE Power and Energy Society, but he's mixing research and practice very successfully. So take it away, Jose.
Sorry, I was realized I just muted. Well, thank you very much, Carlton. I'm presenting today some not typical talk in the area of power system computation, since I'm not presenting specifically a new model or algorithm. I'm presenting today how to develop computational experiments for the design of operational models and simulations. Doing this work in collaboration with Johnny Lee and Duncan Callaway from the Energy and Resources Group, and Bri-Mathias Hodge, which is professor in CU Boulder and also at NREL. So first, I would like to discuss a little bit the motivation for this work. And there's this perceived notion that there is a problem of reproducibility in science. And this has been discussed a lot in journals like Nature, like Science, precisely mostly related to areas of biology and medicine and so on. And I'd like to pose a question to everybody listening. How many times do you see a paper and you find out that it's reproducible? And it seems that there's many drivers for this lack of reproducibility. And with this particular presentation, we want to tackle two of them. One being basically the code availability and the experimental design. So just to bring to light a little bit of why these things are relevant, we saw in the recent days how some of the models and some of the code used for decision-making on the coronavirus has actually shown to be buggy, to not reproduce results, and they can have real-life consequences. So I wonder how many of the operational models I have proposed and have been used for policy or been trying to be implemented are actually, generating wrong conclusions. So the motivation starts with that scientific computing has emerged as a field that allows us to have certain practices such that we can introduce transparency and accuracy in the experimentations carried out with computer simulations. And it stands to reason that in power systems, we really, really need this. Considering that we don't have another network to experiment with, and we don't really have a test bed for a lot of the ideas on how should we operate the system during this energy transition, conducting experiments properly is very valuable for us as a community. And mostly from the reviewer and from the journal writer perspective, I would like to say that these practices allows us to reply with more consistency. The kind of question we get all the time is, how many times, what is the value of your approach? So I think that everybody here at some point has reached that kind of question from the reviewer. So what does it mean to take a scientific computing approach to power system operations research? So although a lot of the practices that we're going to discuss here can be used in many other simulation practices of power systems like EMT or dynamics, I'm going to focus mostly on the proposals around operational models. And the first aspect to consider is the reproducibility of the experiments. So we want something that is able to reproduce the results consistently and focus not only in code readability and how you share this code, version control, and how do you give these tools to other people to reproduce. And in part, we don't implement some of these practices because researchers in power systems are generally not trained, and I count myself as one of those, in scientific computing principles. Even recently, I saw a very well-known professor in power systems basically putting a rant in LinkedIn saying, like, how dare people asking for his code? The second piece that is important in this aspect is to say, what is the validity of the conclusions that we derive? And this is a part that is really important because there's very little discussion about whether the experiment itself can actually, lend the conclusions that researchers put in those papers. And I want to focus on two specific definitions. The one is internal validity, that basically gives us consistency, that we know that our results are a product of the proposal we're making, and the external validity that allows us to say, what is the outcome, whether the outcome of the experiment can actually be generalized to different systems. So what are the considerations for an operations problem experimental design? So the first thing is, what is the hypothesis that the experiment is looking to demonstrate? And very often the hypothesis that we have is whether the model that we're proposing will actually deliver some improvement in the operations. That's most commonly that type of thing we want to demonstrate. And I'm going to use to the talk the example that is in the paper, which is applied to the stochastic unit commitment. So this is not a talk about the stochastic unit commitment, but it's been proposed in so many cases as a solution to lead to more safe operations in the face of uncertainty that actually lends itself as a good example. So the first thing that we have to think about when we develop these computational experiments for operational problems is the data process. And it's a process that generally is overlooked, but having a good way of representing and storing and sharing the experimental parameters, the test systems, the number of samples, and the confounding variables that are used is extremely important. And a lot of times when we ask for the data is basically a bunch of uncategorized CSVs with some naming conventions that are not organized in any way. The second part is what is often confused as the full experiment, which is the computing process. And usually the computing process is solving these discrete optimization problems that have some quasi-steady state representation of the system. And finally, the results and reporting process. So commonly, power system researchers choose some metrics to say that the system is safer when they use a stochastic unit commitment, like it leads to less load shedding or it leads to increased in cost. And having a consistent way of reporting these metrics, not for a single result, but for a set of trials, is important to reach external validity conclusions. So we can separate the different processes in these three aspects. Again, the data process, basically what is my system data, what is my scenarios, the solver of choice, the parameters of that solver if I needed to implement particular settings. The second part is, again, the computing process, which is my operational problem that I'm trying to solve. Is it a unit commitment? Is the solving of the stochastic unit commitment or the economic dispatch? And then finally, what are my different metrics of performance for this operational model? And I can answer that hypothesis by basically saying, does my operational model lead to better or worse different metrics that I chose for the problem? So let's start with the first process, which is the data process. And one of the aspects that needs to be taken into account is how organizing this data input into simulation requires a data model. So for example, in the presentations in this session, few people have actually mentioned the use of pglib and other networks that have been the effort of Carlton over many years. And that's one of the ways that a simple data model can actually lead to improvements in research. But when we talk about operational models, there's less of a data model to be used, since we require time series, we require contingency, we require far more information to actually simulate the operation over time of the model. So the first thing that we need to recognize is that we need this data model. The second piece to take into account is just the very process of taking all this raw data and articulating it into a case study has to be reproducible itself. And that's something not the case. Like a lot of papers just basically say, we use a modified version of the IEEX case, so we use this and the other. However, those modifications are rarely reproducible themselves. So we can summarize the problem by saying we have some data for the model, basically CSVs and XLS files. That data has to be generated and parsed into some kind of organized analytical data, whether it's classes or data frames or arrays or structs. And this whole pipeline is part of the experiment that needs to be provided for reproducibility. So the data, as it comes into the simulation, we can basically have three types of inputs, and we can think about how the selection criteria should go. On the one hand, we have experiment parameters, which is all the information that is held constant across the experiment, where this is the system, where this is the cost function or the generation fleet. So classically in the stochastic unit commitment papers, that's the test system that is used and the generator fleet is constant. Then we have the confounding variables, which is not normally used as a term in power system computational experiments, which is the data that we're going to vary across the trials, to basically obtain internal validity, which means that we want to make sure that the results that we get are a product of the model we're proposing and not because the data has a particular shape or a particular combination of parameters that lead to those improvements. And finally, we have the independent variables, which is basically what are the results coming out of the problem that we use to compare compare the different outcomes of the operational models. For example, in the case, the independent variables is the choice of model between the unit commitment and the stochastic unit commitment. So if this were sort of like a clinical trial, we will say that the independent variable is like the new pill versus the older pill to see if there is an improvement. The second thing that we've been discussing is the simulation model. And again, in many cases, this confuses the experiment itself. And we have to think how this simulation model is consisting of two main parts. One is the decision model, which is the dispatch model that we want to analyze, the improvement ones, and what is our emulator. And the emulator is a really important definition that I want to introduce, because it's the model that will allow us to show and resemble the system performance when operating under the policies coming from the decision model. And the thing that is really, really key is that a lot of operational problem papers and proposals report the output of the decision model as if they were to realize exactly in the emulator. And that a lot of times is not the case. So even though, for example, an stochastic unit commitment can lead to increased commitment and increased reserve, doesn't necessarily imply directly that can lead to more secure operations without an emulator model to test what are the outcomes of the application of the decision model. And finally, the third part is basically the results and the metrics for performance. Basically, if we want to claim that that the model provides more secure operation of the system, then we have to be very, very clear about how we report this as a distribution of the metrics across the trials. And I want to share an example of my own work. This is a result of one of the papers that I've co-authored in the past, where we said, we have this stochastic unit commitment problem is more secure. And the only thing that we did was basically provide this plot with a 24-hour dispatch problem and say we allocated more reserves. However, this actually doesn't lead to a general external validity that says that if you use this model consistently, you achieve better results. So in the paper, we include this similar experiment, but now with the statistical representation of a comparison between unit commitment and stochastic unit commitment. And the experiment, we're actually able to reproduce most of the claims that are in the theoretical papers, right? Basically, we have higher fuel cost on average for all the theory trials that we did for the stochastic unit commitment versus the unit commitment. However, given the scenario representations that we use, on average, we have less load shedding than the deterministic version of the same problem, right? So in this case, we can see, if we compare these two ways of reporting, that using disaggregate metrics instead of just cost alone and representing both the cost of the here and now and the recourse and also the cost of the realized decisions coming from the decision model leads to a more detailed and better insight about the capabilities of the proposed operational models. And finally, including computational times, it's not enough when these are aspects that matter. Including the full computational environment is important. So again, the environment, the way that the software is compiled, the way that the software is used, and the hardware and configurations matter a lot. For instance, for all of us that work with optimization problems, having a really detailed description of how, for every one of those simulations and every one of those runs, we carried out this intermediate data representation, what is the algebraic modeling that we use, and the resulting problem and solver is fundamental, such that we can actually know what to expect, as in many cases, algebraic modeling languages tend to mutate the optimization problem. And finally, let's come back to the initial workflow that I described at the beginning, and basically describe again the relevance of having a detailed data process that is reproducible itself, the computing, including the simulation and emulator, and finally the metrics. So when people actually ask for the code, most of the time what they actually are reflecting is that they have interest in the research that we've conducted and they want to be able to reproduce it. So I think that it's important to consider that a cleaner implementation of computational experiments can lead to much more impact from our research. So in conclusion, The power systems community has a potential huge impact from implementing these scientific computing practices in terms of delivering results into the field. We want to develop this thorough experimental setting so that we can demonstrate the benefits of certain operational models that are required to operate the high penetration of renewable energy. And we need to be able to reproduce these results, which implies consistency across the different processes. And finally, I invite you all to see our repo. We created, the experiments that I described in the paper are available in the repository, both the energy management system for microgrid experiment and the stochastic unit commitment experiment. And we've done the best possible to organize the folders and the code inside to reflect the values that I've described through this presentation. Thank you very much. And just any questions?
Thank you, Jose. I do see one question in the chat. This is from Dan. Jose, thank you for your discussion on this important issue. Could you expand on some of the challenges and barriers to adopting scientific computing practices? For example, page limits in publications, limited ability to distribute data, time and skill required to program and distribute a clear way. How would you overcome these barriers?
Well, I actually think that the main barrier is, and sorry for anyone who is an editor in papers, is basically the editorial boards of the journals. Because power system journals compared to, like I've looked into many other fields like computational biology and genetics, that they have these big requirements of how do you actually share your code, share your data. We don't have any of that infrastructure set up for power system papers. So just by having the proper infrastructure to report all of this and having the editorial boards require this quality of code submission and reproducibility, just even to start a review, will actually benefit at all. So the second thing that I think it's a barrier is that we are always pressured for time. And this is actually funny enough, Nature has reported this to be the #1 reason for not applying reproducibility practices. So I think that even though maybe we can take longer producing a paper, it might be a more valuable paper if we implement all these things. Like we wouldn't want people to rush to publish and to put out a new medicine, right? You want it to be tested. The same way we should be putting out operational problems to solve real problems in a way that are actually thoroughly tested.
I'll ask a kind of a follow-up question to that, which is, I think you did a nice job of describing kind of a theory for how this could be done, but for a PhD student out there, what guidelines could they follow to kind of follow these best practices? I mean, could you get to very specific requirements or templates that people just fill out and then they know they're covered?
Well, I would hope that the paper helps answering that question. And one of the key aspects that we wanted is not to be very pretentious in saying these are the rules that everybody should follow, but put up the conversation of what those should be. And I've gone back to the editors and the journals. A PhD student wanting to publish a paper in Nature Genetics has a very clear guide to the authors about what needs to be done and the level of detail that need to be. There's one software that I mentioned in the paper called Bioconductor. It has over 10,000 citations, because basically nowadays you cannot publish a genetics paper if your data inputs and outputs cannot be expressed in Bioconductor, and it has become the standard in that field. So I think that PhD students are basically stuck with whatever the practices are, which are not great. And if reviewers, if journals, if professors basically become more aware of these requirements, then PhD students will have a better idea. Like I spent 1 year basically writing this paper because I was trying to figure out myself, because nobody ever told me after almost 6 years of grad school, hey, this is how you conduct a simulation experiment actually.
All right. Oh, I think there's one more question, follow-up question. What role do you think that challenges like RPE grid optimization competition could play in pushing this framework?
I think that one of the biggest gains, and this is actually a discussion that we have often, is they provide reasonable data sets to have consistent results across teams. Although I think that the RPE competitions are more towards algorithm, which following the practice of the computer science communities for algorithm testing and algorithm benchmarking has helped a lot. And that's a lot of the work that you guys have conducted in Llano. My main concern is when I come up with a robust optimization model to allocate reserves. And those kind of questions normally are not answered through RPI or these kind of competitions that say, can you come up with a model that will result in less load shedding in this year-long simulation? Can you conduct a whatever economic dispatch on their uncertainty model that will result in fewer curtailment scenarios than current practice? So I think that that's the role that it was supposed to play, and that we have to start thinking about it in those terms.
Great, thank you very much.